Okay, good morning. Welcome to the HSE Conference. Today's speaker is Brittany Tones of Montrose Environmental. We'll be talking about the multi-sector general permit renewal in the state of Texas. And with that, Brittany's been doing the stormwater work since 2006. We're very proud to have her and Montrose as a platinum sponsor at the conference. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Brittany. Take it away.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Steve, for that introduction. I definitely appreciate it. So let's go ahead and get started. Our presentation today is we're preparing your facility for the MSGP renewal here in Texas. Just wanted to give a brief agenda about what we'll be discussing today. So we're going to talk about the history of the multi-sector general permit. I'm going to call it the MSGP from here on out. The current status of where the renewal is at, the proposed changes that are in the draft permit right now, some sector-specific changes, and some tips on preparing for the renewal. And then at the end, like Steve mentioned, we'll have some time for questions and answers. All right, so let's talk just a brief overview of the MSGP and its history. So the TCEQ, or the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, actually received authority from the EPA back in September 1998 to administer what's called the Texas Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or TPDES. Out of that, there was a general permit for industrial stormwater discharges that was promulgated. And that's the TXR 050000, which is why I call it the MSGP, because that's quite a mouthful. This came about under provisions under Section 402 of the Clean Water Act, which is a federal regulation, and also under Chapter 26 of the Texas Water Code, which is where we get our Texas-specific regulations. All right, so what's the current status of the draft MSGP? You'll see that that's a copy of it on the right. The effective date is going to be August 14th, 2021, so we'll talk a little bit about that. So right now we're operating under the current MSGP, which was issued in 2016. Just a quick reminder, so this permit was officially promulgated back in 2001 and has been renewed every 5 years since then. So this is the fifth rendition of this permit. The initial stakeholder meeting discussing the proposed changes and all of the input that has been given from stakeholders, that was held on October 18th, 2019. I was actually in attendance to at that meeting. There was a lot of really good input that was given by stakeholders at that meeting. So what TCEQ did was they actually took that input and made some clarifications in this 2021 draft permit. It was sent over to EPA back in May 15th, 2020. And lucky for us, EPA actually approved the draft MSGP on August 18th, 2020. Why does that matter? So the EPA has promulgated its own MSGP that came into effect in January 2021. And lucky for us, because the EPA approved our permit before they approved the EPA permit, all of those new stringent requirements that are in the EPA's 2021 MSGP did not get incorporated into the TCEQ one that we're looking at for the draft permit now. So I've had a lot of questions revolving around that, but because of the timing, we won't actually see those requirements until the next renewal, which will be in 2026. So the public comment period actually began on December 11th, 2020, and TCEQ actually released the proposed draft permit then and the fact sheet, and all of that included EPA's comments and revisions. And so all that got published back in December. A public meeting was held on January 11th, 2021, and the public comment period closed on January 14th, 2021. What's next? The TCEQ actually just recently sent an update to EPA on April the 27th, and EPA gave its response within the 30-day period. Lucky again for us, the EPA actually approved TCEQ's request when they sent the draft permit back over in April. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, but it was approved by EPA. And so that's good. There were some great changes that came about as a result of that. Now, the intent right now is that the draft permit and fact sheets that have actually been finalized at this point, they're going to be approved by the commissioners in the July 2021 meeting. And right now it is on the agenda for the commissioners meeting to be considered at the July 14th, 2021 meeting. And it's number 1 on the agenda. So feeling pretty confident that the permit as it is right now, which most likely will be in its final rendition, will get approved on that date. And then once it's approved, the revised permit and all those fact sheets will be issued, so everybody can take a look at it and digest it. Right now, I'll tell you the packet's about 347 pages. So lucky for you guys, I've already taken a dive into it, and we'll be giving you some updates on what I've seen so far. Now, the permit does renew on August 14th, 2021. And obviously, that, like I said, the final permit's going to be available for review before then. TCEQ wanted me to remind everybody that the renewals NOIs must be submitted by November 12th, 2021. But you cannot go ahead and prepare the NOI right now in Steers. Everything's going to be deleted on August the 14th. So don't get trigger happy. Wait until August 14th to prepare your renewal NOI. And, just friendly reminder that you actually have to prepare and implement the SWIP with all the new requirements before you're able to do that. So what's next? So I can tell you that the draft MSGP that I've already given a webinar on previously, it has been changed. So it's actually changed in the last month due to the public comments that were received. They received a lot of public comments, and all of them honestly were very good and helpful. And just like our past renewals, we saw this in, 2020, 2011, 2016, 2021, they've incorporated all of those requirements. And, just stay tuned, because there is the off chance that at the July 14th meeting, the commissioners could ask for some changes to the draft permit. That's never happened in the past, but it could. So just make sure that you're keeping tuned into what is going on. So before we talk about what has actually been proposed to be changed in the draft permit, I wanted to talk about what hasn't changed, because these are things that everybody is already familiar with. So there's going to be the preparation and implementation of a SWIP, or your stormwater pollution prevention plan. You still have to do a non-stormwater discharge evaluation, which we'll talk about. You have to still have your pollution prevention team, or your PPT. We still have to have the description of pollutant sources. Remember that there's a narrative portion in the actual SWIP itself, and there's been some changes to some of the narrative portions. So make sure when you're updating the SWIP that you're looking at those. And you're also going to have to go ahead and implement those pollution prevention measures and controls. You still have to do monitoring and reporting, but I do want to note that there's been some changes to some of those requirements and the nuances that we'll talk about. So I wanted to kind of break this up into administrative versus operational changes. So let's talk about administrative changes first. So I, for one, am super stoked that they have actually finally added in the North American Industrial Classification, or NAICS codes. We requested that back in 2016 because the SIC codes are out of date from 1987, actually. They did not adopt it then, but they have adopted it now. So if you look at the draft MSGP in the front, there's actually this really awesome list that has all the NAICS codes on the left hand in a table, and all of the corresponding SIC codes on the right hand table. I know that there was a lot of confusion in past permits on who actually is applicable to the permit, and I think that this is going to be really critical in helping people make that determination a little bit easier. So that was probably the biggest as far as the administrative changes that is helpful to all of us that are making sure that people understand who's applicable and not. Now, the permits have to be submitted electronically unless you have a waiver. Right now, nobody in the state actually has a waiver, and the TCEQ published that in the fact sheet that they just released. They revised the provisional coverage to be 48 hours for paper applications. So remember in the 2016, you had 7 days before you got provisional coverage if you have a paper NOI. Now it's 48 hours, which is consistent with other general permits that we're seeing issued by the state. They did update some items on the NOI and the NOC. I'll talk a little bit about that, here shortly, but just remember that. And this is kind of probably the biggest hot topic item as far as administrative changes. But previously, you did have to have a delegation of signatory form. Previously, you sent it in to TCEQ and kept a copy in your SWIP. Now you have to actually submit that out electronically through STEERS. And so you'll need to keep a copy still in the SWIP, but it's not as easy as it used to be. You actually have to get that delegation approved through STEERS. So that's been a big change that's coming about with this permit. Going back to the notice of change. So this is kind of interesting. So back in 2016, we asked TCEQ, do you have to actually submit an NOC when you move an outfall location? And the answer then was no, you don't. Because remember in 2016, that was the first time that the NOI actually had the outfall latitude and longitude listed. And so as a result of that, TCEQ has gone back and changed their mind. And so now with this 2021 NOI, you actually have to not only do your lat and long of the outfalls like we did previously, but anytime the outfalls change, which we know happens over a 5-year period, because, if you don't have a dedicated, like a pipe that's coming out of your pond or something like that, erosion does create changes to outfalls over time and with certain storm events. So if that does end up changing, just remember now you have to submit the NOC, okay? And that hadn't been done previously, so that's going to be a change as far as operations go. You also have to submit an NOC when you stop benchmark or hazardous metals monitoring due to waivers. So remember that in permit year 1, which is going to start January 1st of 2022 and end on December 31st of 2022, and TCEQ did clarify that there's no sampling or monitoring required from August 14th until January 1st. So just heads up on that. But if you do obtain that waiver in year 1 for the hazardous metals, or the benchmark waiver in year 3, because year 1 and 2 you didn't have any exceedances, you do have to submit an NOC to the TCEQ. So that's been a change as well. And then anytime you're changing the status of the facility, this actually could come into play. We saw this happen this last year because of COVID and economical changes that have been impacting facilities. If the facility does end up going on status of not operating for a while, you are going to have to submit a notice of change to TCEQ to let them know that. New requirement now too is those NOCs before were just submitted to TCEQ. Now you have to also submit them to your MS4 operator. And I will tell you that when I do stormwater audits, one thing that is most of the time missed is that NOIs or NOTs have not been submitted to the MS4 operator. So keep that in mind as you're changing any of these items. You do have to go ahead and submit that to the MS4 as well. Now, the notice of termination, I just kind of spoke about this, but if it is required by the MS4 operator, then you do have to submit that. So if you close down a facility, you're no longer operating under the general permit, you have an individual permit, or you're tying in your stormwater under your wastewater permit, you will have to submit that notice of termination to the MS4 operator, only if required though. So just want to make that distinction. I know that personally, I'm going to be looking at MS4 ordinances to understand who requires that and who doesn't, but just keep that in mind as you're moving forward. All right, so just, this has always been assumed, at least since the 2006 permit, but anytime you have submitted renewals in the past, it was implied that you had to update your SWIP and that you have to implement that before submitting your NOI. with all of the new requirements of the new permit. This time they've actually explicitly said that. So your SWIP, it has to be updated. So if you have a SWIP or you are a consultant and you're helping your clients update their SWIPs, or they have questions on whether it's required or not, it is now. And you have to do that before you submit the NOI. And just a friendly reminder that you're certifying under penalty of law that the SWIP has been developed, renewed, updated, and implemented before you submit that NOI. So just a friendly reminder for people that may just want to go ahead and submit the NOI before doing that. You're not allowed to per the permit requirements. Now, one thing that was proposed was that you had to post a sign or other notice of permit coverage. This was a big change for everybody that is regulated under this permit. They did that because EPA requested TCEQ to add that into the draft permit to be consistent with EPA's permits that require that. And so what happened is there was a lot of public comments that came about and a lot of questions revolving around that. So that's actually why the TCEQ pushed back the permit in April 27th of 2021 back to EPA to request that they actually rescind this requirement. And great news, just found out it has been rescinded. So that was good. And another reason to remember why public comments are so crucial and critical to the TCEQ, because they were able to provide that to EPA to get that taken away. So that's a big update that's come out in the last week. Now, you also have to electronically submit your discharge monitoring reports or your DMRs, but they explicitly clarified, thank goodness, that you only have to do that when exceedances occur. So you remember in the 2016 permit, it said the same thing. They had paper DMRs at this time, but it said that you only had to submit the paper DMR if you exceeded an NEL. So TCEQ is going to continue that requirement. But if you do exceed, you do have to actually electronically submit it now. And that'll go through TCEQ's system, and more info on that because they're rolling that out right now. So stay tuned for that because that's going to be an upcoming update in the next month or two. And good news, you no longer have to also submit your results to the regional office. And the thought process behind that is TCEQ is like, well, we already have access to it electronically, so there's no reason for you to have to do a submittal separately to the region office. All right, some other changes. The drainage area sitemap now has to include the latitude and longitude of outfalls. So remember when I talked previously about the NOC, that if you move those locations, you're going to have to submit the NOC. Also, if you move the location of the outfalls, just remember you're going to have to update the drainage area sitemap at the same time. And they put in a new requirement that I thought was interesting. You also have to include large plots of lands where no industrial activity is occurring. So let me give you an example of this. Say you have a facility and it's on a property that's 14 acres. Well, let's just say the facility itself is only 10 of the 14 acres. And the other 4 acres of it is just non-regulated industrial activity. So it's either vacant land or, you know, it may be a parking lot, what have you. Previously, we would only focus on the industrial area, but now TCEQ is actually saying they want to see the whole property. And then you just have to state that there's no industrial activity occurring in that area. Good news is TCEQ is not requiring that an outfall be added in that area, even if there is an outfall or there's multiple locations where stormwater is running off. It's still not regulated. They just want you to show it. So just a little distinction that's coming about. They've also added that, oh man, this was pretty controversial, just pointing this out, but they've added that the SWIP of facilities that are actually handling the pre-production plastic have to contain good housekeeping measures and BMPs to eliminate that plastic. There was pages of public comments that are surrounding this. And so TCEQ did give some clarification, and I actually copied and pasted this out of the fact sheet, but they did clarify what the plastic material is that's going to be regulated now, or it's going to have to be addressed as part of the narrative description of your pollutant sources. And it does include virgin recycled plastic resin pellets, powders, flakes, powdered additives, regrind, and then this is where a lot of people are going to be affected: scrap, waste, and recycling materials. I want to point out that this does affect every sector. This is in the front part of the permit before we get into sector specific requirements. So if you have pre-production plastic or plastic that meets this definition, you are going to have to address this in the SWIP and come up with control measures and BMPs to address this as far as your facility's operations go. They also got very specific and added a requirement to sector Y, which is rubber and miscellaneous plastic products. They now have to actually put in either a containment system or a separator for plastic before stormwater runoff goes off site. So just keep that in mind if you're working with sector Y, or if you're in sector Y, that you're going to have to make some operational changes based on that. I've gotten a lot of questions and feedback on this. I will say that this came about as a House bill to reduce plastic waste into surface waters of the state. And it was also at the direction of EPA, who is also looking at reducing plastic. So this requirement is implemented and it's not going away. So as far as monitoring goes, they did finally clarify, and I know for some people they're not happy with this, but they did say that the rain gauge has to be kept on site. And so why does this matter? There's some facilities that are in robust systems, like let's just say the Houston area, where there is a awesome, flood network that has all sorts of rain gauges throughout the city that actually monitors rainfall. And you can look at it and see it over, 24 hours, over a 10-day period. And so a lot of facilities ask, can we just use that instead of having to have the burden of the rain gauge on site? And TCEQ came back and said, no, you actually have to have it on site. And now they clarified in this permit that they kind of contradicted themselves in a couple places in the 2016 permit, but that has been resolved. And so they did clarify that the rain gauge does have to be kept on site in all of those different areas. And then this was kind of assumed with the last permit, but they have clarified that now you have to have that narrative for the nature of adverse conditions. So remember, you're exempt from being required to do monitoring or sampling during adverse conditions like hail or thunderstorms or anything that would put your personal safety into play. Now you actually have to describe what that is, and you also have to put the rain gauge reading of that adverse event. And so you're proving to TCEQ that yes, there was an adverse event. This was how much rainfall there was, so it may have been a qualifying event, but you didn't take that sample because your safety was in jeopardy. They also made very clear that monitoring is not required in year 5 of the permit cycle. This was not made clear in 2016. I have people that have been monitoring and sampling in 2021 because they were confused on whether or not they had to do it. And good news is they made that clarification. You're just going to have to sample in 2022, 23, 24, and 25, not in 2026. They also clarified that the results of the hazardous metals do need to be kept on site. So not only do you need to have, because we're getting away from the paper DMRs, we're actually going to include the analytical results and the SWIP, which you should have been doing previously, but they did clarify that. So let's talk about sector-specific changes. They did actually change some tables for sectors A, C, D, and S. They revised the tables for the federal effluent guidelines, but I did want to note that they didn't actually change any of the limits. They just made the wording to match what's in 40 CFR. So it just reflects the EPA's MSGP or NEL requirements a little bit better. For sectors E, J, and O, they also revised that table. Note that those limits didn't change either. They also revised the language to require that the rain gauge has to be on site. So do you remember earlier that I said that there was some conflict on this in the sector specific requirements? This is what I was referring to. Now they have made that change and it's consistent throughout. And then for Sector J only, they did add that you have to implement BMPs for the following items: the offsite vehicle tracking of sediments, which honestly, if you're Sector J, you should have been already addressing that, because we know that tracking and street sweeping is probably going to be implemented as part of your BMPs. The generation of dust, the dewatering of trenches and excavations, which is super important because say you're in Sector J and you're maybe doing sand mining. Making sure that you are putting the proper controls in place when you're dewatering any of those open pits or trenches that drain off of the pits. So that's crucial. Remember that you're going to need at least a dewatering bag or some other type of control. And then also talking about the pumping or dewatering of standing water. So that's just not only in the excavation or trench areas, but that could be in other areas of the site. For Sector L, they added definitions for final cover and immediate cover, which is good because that was a little confusing previously. And they also replaced interim with intermediate. So just a little bit of a definition change. They also added that the sitemap has to depict your inactive solid waste landfill cells or units. So previously we only had to show what was active, but now we have to show the inactive cells as well. And they replaced the word trenches with units, which just brings a little bit more clarification to Sector L. And then they actually removed the examples of temporary stabilization measures. They didn't want to feel like people were limited to what temporary stabilization measures that they could implement or initiate at their site. And so they took out those examples to not limit people on what they could do to meet those requirements. And then for Sector T, we actually saw a benchmark level change. It is more restrictive. So the BOD or biological oxygen demand is now 15 mgl. But I did want to note that this is only going to affect your activity code TW for certain wastewater treatment plants. Remember, there's actually a gallon per day limit that brings you into this category. So it doesn't affect Sector T as a whole, just the activity code TW. And then also there were some changes to Sector U. Again, they raised the benchmark levels for TSS. It was 100, it's now back to 50 mgls, which is consistent with all the other sectors that are in the permit. I did want to also point out that this only affects SIC codes 2074 to 2079. So if you are Sector U and you're outside of those SIC codes, you're not impacted by this. There's also additional sediment and erosion controls. Now, this is affecting everybody in Sector U that have to be implemented to meet the revised limit. And I show here just an example of what you can use. This is a dewatering bag on top of hay bales with a layer of silt fence behind it. And note that it's in a kind of vegetated area too. So all of those are ideas that you can implement at your facility to make sure you're addressing erosion and sediment control. And then for Sector Y, I already kind of talked about this previously. They did require that there is a BMP that has to be implemented to keep rubber and different products out of stormwater runoff, but it is very specific and geared towards plastic product. And that's where I was talking about that there has to be some type of containment system to trap plastic. This is going to be an operational change for Sector Y. If this is not already in place, then you definitely want to be thinking about budgeting for that. Or, you know, if you are in the consulting world, letting or advising your client to know that that's something that they need to start budgeting and thinking about if they don't have this in place. So what do you have to do to prepare for the renewal? Well, so the first step, and this I talked about, that you're certifying under penalty of law that this is done. You're going to have to revise and update the SWIP before submitting the renewal NOI. And just a pro tip, go ahead and evaluate your outfall locations now to make sure there have not been changes, because obviously we want to go ahead and have the correct outfall locations in your renewal NOI so you don't have to submit a notice of change later. And the thought would be you would only have to submit that notice of change if something actually does change, as far as like water runoff is redirected or what have you. If you don't have access to steers, I would go ahead and create an account, because remember, not only is a signatory under 30544 of the Texas Administrative Code going to have to sign and certify the NOI, they're also going to have to submit delegation forms to the 305128 people that have signatory for reports, and that has to be done within steers. So not only does the steers account need to be set up for the 30544 person, but also for the 305128 person is how I understand it right now. TCEQ is still working through the kinks on what this is going to look like, so that may change, but just a heads up that if you want to get prepared in advance, you may want to go ahead and just go ahead and sign up for steers. And note that if you don't have a Texas driver's license, you're going to have to sign what's called a paper SPA or steers participation agreement and mail that into TCEQ. And so that could add, you know, a little bit of time for you to get your approval. And TCEQ asked me to point this out, that the steers delegation of signatory forms also will not be available until August 14th. So while we're saying that people should go ahead and get registered for steers, don't actually do anything in the system until August 14th. They are going to go in, and they did this in 2016, so I can tell you it's really going to happen. They're going to delete everything, and you have to start from scratch. You could go ahead and be thinking about your hazardous metals waiver. So you won't be actually sampling until January 1st of next year, but you can look at past analytical results and be thinking of which outfalls you may want to waiver out. Remember that if you do end up waivering out in permit year 1, you're going to have to submit that notice of change. And this is often, very often overlooked. Don't forget that you have to do your non-stormwater discharge certification. So not only the certification, but the evaluation as well. That has to be done within 180 days of permit submittal. So note that I didn't actually put a timeline associated with that, because the clock is going to start the day you submit your NOI. A lot of times people think that you just do that once and then you're done. But every time the permit renews, you have to do this within that 180 days. Just friendly reminder that the NOI has to be submitted between August 14th and November the 12th, and don't forget to send it to your MS4 operator. So, in summary, just want to point out some major takeaways of this. Remember that the SWIP has to be updated first, and that you need to be looking at your outfall locations. Remember that you need to create a steers account and then sign the delegation of signatory reports once it's available after August 14th. And then you have to submit that renewal NOI to TCEQ and the MS4 operator by November the 12th. And now we're moving into the question and answer portion of the webinar. So let me know if you have any questions.
Okay, Brittany, thank you very much for the webinar today. That was a fantastic webinar, great content, and this webinar will be, or was recorded and will be posted on our 4C YouTube channel. And again, thank you very much for the amazing content. We look forward to seeing you at the 4C Conference, August 18th to the 20th, 2021 in Austin, Texas. And with that, we'll conclude the webinar. And thank you very much again. Thank you very much for the participants.
Yes, thank you guys, and thank you for hosting us. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Brittany.
Thank you.